Let's talk about bias. Usually what happens when someone calls me to come and coach with them is they usually start with, we would like you to come and teach us and train us about bias. That's usually what happens. And it sounds great, doesn't it? I mean, it sounds great. Like it sounds great, and it sounds like, yes, this is the first place to start. But I want to challenge you as you're thinking about this, that usually I don't come in and talk about bias. It's not the first thing that I talk about. It's bias and blind spots are everywhere, but it's not the first thing that I talk about. And in fact, one of the last groups of people that have called me to come in and teach about bias, I usually say, no, I'm not going to do that. Because usually bias, implicit bias training, those sorts of things are part of a to-do list and part of compliance training. If you are an HR manager, or you are running a business or a part of that world, there are some things that you do have to do around the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion that go along the lines of compliance, and you need to do that. That's not necessarily what I do. I'll come in and I'll tell you about bias and blind spot because that's part of the teaching and the training. But we can't only talk about bias, because what we're trying to do is actually bigger than bias. Let me share just a few thoughts around this, around bias and blind spot. I like both of those words. I like bias and blind spot because oftentimes they go together. Here's what you need to know is that we're human. We're human beings, and bias and blind spot will follow us forever. And here's the thing that you have to know if you're starting into this work is that once you start to be aware of bias and blind spot, it's very important for you to not judge yourself at first around it, particularly if you are moving towards more learning, if you're moving towards more information. It's really important for you not to judge it, because as soon as you start to unearth and uncover the fact that you have bias and blind spot, chances are, if you're entering this work with curiosity, that you're going to feel bad about it, right? Now, it's okay to feel bad about it. It's just not okay then to go into the judgment hole, right? The judgment hole of, I shouldn't be biased. I shouldn't have blind spots. Here's the thing to know, is that we're human. And because we're human, we're all going to have blind spot and bias. And that's why we need each other. That's why you need a diverse team. That's why you need a diverse life, is so that the more diverse that your life gets around you, the easier it then becomes to start to recognize, or to have people around you that you trust start to help you realize your bias and your blind spot. And never come in with a company or even an individual and start with the idea of bias and blind spot, because it has to be bigger than that. Do you see my face? It has to be bigger than that. We cannot just start with bias and blind spot training and then do nothing else afterwards. It actually can lead to big problems in your organization as you're trying to move forward. So here's the thing to know is that, again, we all have bias, we all have blind spot. Most of how we operate centers around unintentional blind spot and unintentional bias. This is when, depending on how we grew up or in the environments we're in, or even the lack of diversity in our personal lives, that we can just kind of walk around and not really know that a way of thinking that we have or something that we say is ultimately biased or has a blind spot in it. Now, once we're aware of the bias and the blind spot, then we have a choice. And this is where the rubber meets the road. We have a choice. Will we continue on in the unintentional bias and blind spot? Because if we decide to continue on and not do anything about it or not challenge it at all, then it turns into what is intentional blind spot and intentional bias. And that's where we begin to have serious problems. That's when people in our organizations, in our companies, and even in our life can be hurt, is when we cannot find the courage to make a change once we are aware of this unintentionality, and then it becomes intentional. And so that is the work that we lean into, is saying, what are the unintentional bias and blind spot, and how do we make a change then to move forward so that it's not intentional any longer. That will be part of the key to our freedom as we are moving in and out of culture work.